Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. My name is Callum Whitaker, and in 2017, I found myself trekking through the depths of Olympic National Park. I'd always been more of a city mouse, but after my startup went belly up, I figured getting lost in the woods couldn't be worse than getting lost in spreadsheets. On the second day of my hike, I met a pair of fellow travelers at a fork in the trail. "Hey there, you look like you know where you're going," I called out, hoping my map-reading skills weren't as questionable as my life choices. The taller one turned around. "Only if lost counts as a direction," he chuckled. "I'm Eamon, and this is Bryony." "Callum," I replied, shaking their hands. "Glad to know I'm not the only one who's navigationally challenged." We decided to join forces, reasoning that 3 confused hikers were better than 1. As we walked, the canopy above thickened, and the sunlight struggled to pierce through the leaves. The conversation flowed easily, filled with the kind of jokes you tell strangers to pass the time. "So, what brings you two out here?" I asked. Bryony smiled. "We're photographers. Thought we'd capture some of the park's beauty before heading back to the chaos of the city." Eamon adjusted the camera strap on his shoulder. "Plus, it's an excuse to avoid my mother's cooking for a few days. Last time I wasn't sure if I was eating meatloaf or a doorstop." I laughed. "Sounds like you haven't tried my attempts at gourmet. Let's just say the fire alarm is my kitchen timer." The trail grew narrower, and the trees seemed to close in around us. A rustling sound came from the underbrush. "Did you hear that?" Bryony whispered. "Probably just a squirrel," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Eamon peered into the foliage. "That's either a big squirrel or a small bear." We pressed on, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The forest was eerily quiet now, as if the birds and insects had taken a collective vow of silence. "Maybe nature's giving us the silent treatment," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, I didn't forget it's birthday," Eamon replied, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. As dusk approached, we decided to set up camp in a small clearing. We gathered wood for a fire, and soon the flames provided a comforting glow against the encroaching darkness. "Anyone up for some campfire stories?" Bryony suggested. "Sure," I said, "but fair warning, my stories are as good as my cooking." Eamon smirked. "In that case, maybe we should skip to marshmallows." We laughed, but the levity was short-lived. A distant howl echoed through the trees. "Did wolves return to this area?" Bryony asked, her eyes wide. "I didn't think so," Eamon replied. "Could be a coyote. Or maybe someone's dog got loose," I added, though something about the sound unsettled me. We tried to shake it off, but the forest seemed different now, more sinister. The fire crackled and shadows danced around us. "I'm going to grab more firewood," Eamon said, standing up. "I'll come with you," I offered. "No need, I'll be quick." He disappeared into the darkness before I could protest. Minutes ticked by, and Eamon didn't return. "He's taking his sweet time," Bryony remarked, poking at the fire. "I'll go check on him," I said. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the woods. "Eamon?" I called out. No response. A few yards from the campsite, I found the pile of sticks he'd gathered scattered on the ground. "Very funny, man. You can jump out now." Silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted something on the ground, a smear of dark liquid. I knelt down and shone the light on it. Blood. My stomach tightened. "Bryony!" I shouted, turning back toward the camp. A scream pierced the air. I sprinted back, branches whipping against my face. When I burst into the clearing, the sight froze me in my tracks. The tent was shredded, and Bryony was nowhere to be seen. The fire had dwindled, casting weak shadows. I heard heavy breathing behind me. Slowly, I turned around. Standing there was a massive creature, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It stood on hind legs like a man, but was covered in coarse fur. Its face resembled that of a wolf, but larger and more menacing. Claws extended from its hands, or paws, and they were stained dark. My mind raced. This was no bear or wolf. It was something else entirely. It snarled, revealing sharp teeth that could rend flesh with ease. I didn't wait to find out. I bolted into the woods, adrenaline propelling me forward. The creature gave chase, crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but I didn't stop. I could hear its footsteps gaining on me. In a desperate move, I veered off the path and slid down a steep embankment. I tumbled and landed hard at the bottom, the wind knocked out of me. Above, the creature peered over the edge, its eyes searching. I held my breath, pressing myself against the dirt. After a few tense moments, it moved on. I waited until I was sure it was gone before I dared to move. Every muscle ached, but I couldn't stay there. Cautiously, I made my way along the base of the embankment, hoping to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. Hours seemed to pass as I stumbled through the forest. The moon provided scant light, and every shadow looked like a new threat. Just when despair threatened to overtake me, I saw a faint glow ahead. Pushing forward, I emerged onto a dirt road where an old pickup truck was parked. Relief washed over me. I approached the vehicle, knocking on the window. An elderly man startled awake. "What in tarnation? Please, I need help," I gasped. "There's something in the woods. My friends." He eyed me skeptically but saw the state I was in. "Get in." As we sped away, I glanced back at the tree line. For a moment, I thought I saw those piercing eyes watching us. The man introduced himself as Gus. "You're lucky I decided to pull over for a nap," he said. "Not many folks come down this road." "Luck might be pushing it," I muttered. He drove me to the nearest ranger station. I reported everything. Eamon, Bryony, the creature. The rangers exchanged glances but agreed to organize a search. The next day they found the campsite, or what was left of it. Torn equipment, bloodstains, but no bodies. They questioned me extensively, suspicion evident in their eyes. Without evidence of foul play, they couldn't hold me, but I knew they didn't believe a word I said. Back home, sleep eluded me. Images of the creature haunted every quiet moment. Determined to find answers, I delved into local legends and reports. Hidden in the archives, I discovered accounts dating back a century, tales of a beast that roamed the forests, a predator smarter than any animal but fiercer than any man. Locals called it the Shunka-Warakin, a creature from Native American lore resembling a wolf but larger and more formidable. Some believed it was a spirit guarding the land, striking against those who disrespected the forest. Others thought it was a relic from a bygone era, a species thought to be extinct. I reached out to a local historian, Dr. Marisol Kane. We met at a quaint cafe near the park. "You're not the first to see it," she said, sipping her tea. "But sightings are rare, and survivors even rarer." "Why doesn't anyone do anything?" I asked. She sighed. "Because most people don't believe it exists, and those who do think it's better left alone." "Left alone? It's dangerous. My friends are missing, presumed dead." She looked at me with a mix of sympathy and resignation. The forest has its own rules. Sometimes it's best not to meddle. Frustrated, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Armed with a camera, a map, and sheer determination, I planned to return to the park. If I could capture evidence, maybe authorities would take me seriously. Before setting out, I met with Gus again. "You're a fool if you go back there," he warned. "Maybe," I replied, "but I can't just let this go." He sighed heavily. "At least take this." He handed me a worn-out revolver. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." I returned to the forest, retracing my steps to the ill-fated campsite. The area was eerily quiet, nature holding its breath. As night fell, I stationed myself in a tree stand I'd discovered earlier, hoping elevation would offer some safety. Hours passed in silence, then movement below. Through the lens of my camera, I spotted it, the creature, sniffing around the remnants of the camp. My heart pounded, but I steadied the camera, snapping photos. The flash caught its attention. It looked up directly at me, eyes reflecting the light. With alarming agility, it began climbing the tree. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for the revolver, aiming downward. As it neared, I fired. The shot echoed through the forest. The creature recoiled, a pained howl escaping its jaws. It lost its grip and fell to the ground. I didn't wait to see if it was dead or merely wounded. I descended the opposite side of the tree and ran. Behind me I heard rustling and the unmistakable sound of pursuit. Breaking through the tree line, I found myself on a road where a park ranger's vehicle was parked. I waved frantically. The ranger, a woman named Officer Delgado, stepped out. "What's going on?" "No time to explain, we have to go." Seeing the terror in my eyes, she didn't argue. We sped away as the first light of dawn broke. At the station, I showed them the photos. Blurry but unmistakable, a hulking figure unlike any known animal. This time, they took me seriously. The team was dispatched to investigate. Days later, they reported finding traces, blood samples, tracks, but no creature. The official statement was inconclusive, citing the possibility of a bear attack. Eamon and Bryony were declared missing, presumed dead. I knew the truth, but felt powerless to do more. The authorities were unwilling to acknowledge what lurked in those woods. Months passed, and life resumed an uneasy semblance of normalcy. One evening, I received a package without a return address. Inside was an old journal. Flipping through it, I realized it belonged to a biologist named Dr. Everett Lang, who had vanished decades ago. His notes detailed experiments aimed at enhancing animal intelligence and strength. He mentioned a remote laboratory near Olympic National Park where he conducted his trials. In the final entry, he wrote about a successful hybrid, combining wolf DNA with something he only referred to as Subject X. The creature had escaped, and he feared the consequences. It all clicked. The creature wasn't a myth or a spirit, but a product of human meddling, a science experiment gone horribly wrong. I sat back, the journal heavy in my hands. The motivations behind the creature's attacks were clear now. It was defending itself, a lone predator born from man's hubris. In the end, I realized that some secrets are buried for a reason, and digging them up can unleash horrors beyond imagination. My name's Grant Ellerby, and in 2019 I found myself caught in one of the strangest, most twisted nights of my life, while camping out near the edge of Crater Lake National Park. I'd like to tell you, this was just a roughing it trip, but the truth is, I decided to try out a new RV I got off my cousin Derek, who's known for selling almost new gear that barely holds together. The RV was old, dented, and probably in worse shape than my beat-up station wagon, but hey, a deal's a deal. I'd been running from my city life, or at least I was trying to convince myself I needed a break from it. A week with nothing but trees, my lopsided camp stove, and a folding chair sounded great on paper. In real life, it was lonely as all hell. The first couple of days, I busied myself with hiking and cooking sad attempts at camp food, which mostly involved canned chili and things I could stab with a stick over the fire. But by the third day, I was beginning to realize why folks don't typically spend much time out here alone. Now, Crater Lake's a beautiful place, but it's isolated. You don't have the crowds of Yosemite or Yellowstone. It's more quiet. I spent a lot of time listening to every little crackle and crunch in the trees, figuring it was either a bear or maybe a ranger who'd gotten a whiff of my chili experiments and was ready to find me for culinary crimes. Then, on the fourth evening, I heard the sound. It was sharp, sudden, like metal scraping against metal. The RV had been creaking and rattling since I got it, but this noise was different. I froze, and as I strained to listen, it stopped. I laughed at myself, figured I'd probably just hit my paranoia peak, and turned back to the fire. I threw in another log, settled back, and let the quiet wrap around me. An hour later, I heard it again, but this time it was closer. "Hey, who's there?" I called out, hoping that it was maybe just another camper who'd taken a wrong turn. Silence. The fire crackled, and I scanned the tree line. There was nothing but shadows. I was about to chalk it up to the forest playing tricks on me, when I caught a glint of something metallic. The gleam was low to the ground, moving slowly as if someone was crawling just beyond the reach of the firelight. My throat went dry. I held my breath, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise as the figure came into view. It was a man, crawling on his hands and knees, his face hidden in the dark. He was holding something, dragging it along the ground with a scraping sound that made my teeth clench. I took a step back toward the RV, hand fumbling for the handle, but the man stopped, raised his head, and grinned. "Evening," he rasped, his voice raw, like he hadn't used it in years. He stood up slowly, unfurling like some creature shaking off the night. His face came into the light, and I could see he had wild, unkempt hair, a scar running across his jaw, and a pair of glasses that looked like they'd been pieced together from scraps of wire. He wore a dark trench coat, its pockets sagging with heavy, uneven bulges. "Lost?" I managed, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel my hand trembling on the RV handle. He tilted his head, that grin stretching wider. "No, not lost, just looking for company." I forced a laugh. "Well, I'm kind of in the middle of my own thing here. You've got a pretty nice setup." He nodded toward the RV, then at the fire. "Real cozy." "Yeah, I like it," I said, trying to sound casual, though every instinct was screaming for me to get inside, lock the door, and drive the hell out of there. The man's gaze shifted down to the fire, then back to me. "Mind if I join you?" His tone wasn't so much a question as a challenge. He took a step closer, and I could see his hands were streaked with grime. My brain scrambled for an excuse, anything to make him leave. "Actually, I was just about to turn in," I said, swallowing. "Long day, you know?" The man's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, sure," he muttered. "Long days. Lots of those around here." He didn't move, just stood there staring at me with this fixed look, like he was sizing up a piece of meat. Then, without warning, he turned and walked toward the fire. He dropped something from his coat, a small metal object that clinked against the rocks. In the glow of the firelight, I recognized it. A surgical scalpel, the blade glinting as it caught the light. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I yanked open the RV door and scrambled inside, slamming it shut and locking it. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone, but when I looked, there was no signal. The RV was dark, and I could barely see out the windows. The man was still outside, pacing around, muttering to himself. But I could hear him scraping something along the side of the RV, scratching marks into the metal. I whispered a stream of curses under my breath, trying to think. There was a small hunting knife in the drawer by the stove. Not much, but it was something. I grabbed it and held it tightly, creeping toward the window to see where he'd gone. The scraping stopped, then a tap at the window. He was there, peering in, his face twisted in that same grin. He leaned close, pressing his nose to the glass, fogging it with his breath. "You can't stay in there forever, Grant," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I froze. How did he know my name? I don't remember making the decision. One second I was frozen in fear, the next I was lunging for the RV's driver's seat, jamming the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life and I threw it into gear, tearing out of there without a second thought. I could see him in the side mirror, standing by the fire, watching me drive off. His face a pale smear in the rear view as he disappeared into the dark. I thought that was it, that I'd made it. But 10 minutes later, as I was driving down the winding forest road, I caught a glimpse of headlights in the mirror. My stomach sank. I sped up, but the car behind me matched my speed, tailing me close enough that I could see the outline of the driver's face in my mirror. It was him. Come on, I muttered, slamming my foot on the gas. The RV rattled and groaned, barely holding together as I pushed it faster down the road. Ahead, the road split in two directions. I didn't have time to think. I veered right, hoping it would throw him off, but his headlights followed, the glare growing closer, brighter. The RV shuddered, the wheel bucking in my hands as I struggled to keep control. The road narrowed, trees closing in on either side, branches scraping against the sides like claws. Then, just as the road took a sharp curve, his car swerved, slamming into the side of the RV with a force that sent me crashing against the door. The RV spun, tires skidding on the gravel, and I fought to keep it from flipping as it lurched to a stop. Silence. My head was ringing, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I looked up, expecting him to be right there, waiting. but his car had stopped a few feet behind, headlights off, just a dark shadow on the road. For a long, tense moment, neither of us moved. Then his door opened, and he stepped out, silhouetted in the moonlight. He was holding something in his hand, the glint of metal catching the light, a machete, long and dull, nicked along the edge. I didn't have time to think. I flung open the RV door and bolted into the trees, ducking low as I ran, not daring to look back. Branches whipped at my face, the ground uneven and slippery. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps crashing through the underbrush, and I pushed myself faster, lungs burning, legs screaming. I stumbled, catching myself against a tree, my fingers digging into the rough bark. Ahead, the trees began to thin, the ground sloping down toward the lake. I risked a glance back and saw him, his silhouette moving between the trees, machete held low. "Grant," he called, voice echoing through the woods. "Come on out, let's finish this." I didn't answer, slipping down the slope toward the water. I could see the faint outline of an old boathouse near the shore, half collapsed and covered in moss. Desperate, I ducked inside, pressing myself against the damp wood, heart hammering as I tried to catch my breath. The footsteps stopped. I strained to listen, every nerve on edge, waiting for him to come crashing in. But there was only silence. Then a slow creak, the sound of wood groaning as he stepped onto the dock outside. "Thought you'd be tougher," he said, his voice drifting through the walls. "All that running just for me to find you here, like a rat in a trap." I held my breath, gripping the hunting knife so tight it hurt. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and I saw the glint of his machete, the edge slicing through the faint moonlight as he stepped into the boathouse. He took a step forward, and I could see his face in the dim light, twisted with a sick kind of glee. He raised the machete, taking his time, savoring the moment. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I lunged forward, slamming the knife into his side. He let out a grunt, stumbling back, eyes wide with shock. I twisted the blade, pushing deeper, feeling the resistance as he staggered, dropping the machete with a clatter. He slumped to the ground, his hands clutching the wound, blood seeping through his fingers. I stumbled back, gasping, heart racing as I watched him struggle, his breath rattling in his chest. For a long moment, he just lay there, eyes glazed, his hand twitching as he reached for the machete. But his strength was gone. With one last shuddering breath, he went still, the light fading from his eyes. I staggered out of the boathouse, the night air cold against my skin, my mind numb as I stumbled back toward the RV. I stumbled back up the slope, barely aware of the blood smeared on my clothes, my hands shaking as I reached the RV. I climbed in, feeling the coolness of the wheel beneath my fingers as I gripped it tight, steadying myself. I turned the ignition, and after a moment's hesitation, the engine roared to life. Relief flooded through me, my mind still racing but anchored by the familiar hum of the engine. As I drove away, headlights cutting through the darkness, I tried to process what had just happened. His face, that twisted grin, the way he'd known my name, all of it circled in my mind like some surreal nightmare. But the wound I'd left on him, the blood, it was real, tangible proof of everything. I was almost out of the forest when I saw something that made my stomach drop. Parked by the side of the road was a dark SUV, its windows tinted, with a thick layer of dust caked on the back. Emblazoned on the rear bumper was an old, nearly faded decal, *Crater Lake, Volunteer Search and Rescue. As I drove past, I glanced back and noticed something else. A pile of clothes and personal items scattered in the dirt nearby. I didn't stop. I couldn't. But as I kept driving, I pieced it together. He must have once been part of the search and rescue team. Maybe someone who'd ventured out to help people, until something twisted him. Maybe it was isolation, or maybe he'd just seen too much. Whatever it was, it had left him hunting for company, preying on anyone who got too close to his part of the woods. I finally reached the edge of the forest, the lights of a distant highway flickering like salvation on the horizon. The RV rattled over the gravel road, every bump a reminder that I was still alive. I pushed onward, away from the darkness of Crater Lake, away from the boathouse, the blood-streaked ground, and the silence that hung thick and heavy over those trees. As I merged onto the highway, I thought about making a report, about telling someone what had happened. But then I remembered his face, that smile he'd worn when he first approached me, like he'd already anticipated every move I'd make. He knew the forest, knew the ins and outs of every trail and hidden spot. By the time anyone went looking, there'd be nothing left to find but an empty boathouse, a pile of clothes, and an unsettling silence that would keep his secrets buried in the dark. The RV rolled on, and with each mile the forest receded, swallowed by distance and the night. I took the wrong turn around 5:30, trying to navigate the back roads of West Virginia. It wasn't my first time driving through those mountains, but something felt off this time. Maybe it was my gut telling me I should have stuck to the main highway, or the uneasy quiet that settled over the hills. The year was 1997, and I was driving home from visiting my brother in Ohio, trying to make it back to Richmond by nightfall. But as soon as I took that right turn, the GPS in my car flickered and went out. Figures, I thought. Typical technology failure in the mountains. I sighed and pressed on, knowing I had a good sense of direction. You could say I'm the stubborn type. My name's Colin Atwood, and I've always been a bit bullheaded when it comes to listening to other people's advice, especially about staying on the main roads. My brother warned me, said that these backwoods were easy to get lost in, but I liked the quiet. Living in Richmond, you get used to the chaos and noise, and I figured a few extra miles through the countryside wouldn't hurt. But it wasn't long before the road started narrowing. The asphalt turned to dirt, then gravel, and soon I was bumping along a rutted trail that barely resembled a road at all. I should have turned around right then, but something kept me going. Stubbornness, maybe. The trees on either side of me grew denser, their branches clawing at the sky like they wanted to swallow the road whole. I could feel the tension building in my chest, but I kept driving, convincing myself that this road had to lead somewhere. 15 minutes passed, and that's when I saw it. A battered old mailbox at the side of the road, the name Moser scrawled across it in faded letters. There was a narrow dirt driveway leading off into the woods. Against my better judgment, I slowed down. There hadn't been another house or sign of life for miles, and a part of me hoped someone could point me in the right direction. As I sat there, idling in the car, the wind rustled through the trees, and a faint sound carried through the woods. It was distant, but unmistakable. Laughter. Not the kind you hear from a group of kids playing outside, though. No, this was harsh and guttural, like something was wrong with it. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the gear shift. The smart thing would have been to keep driving, but I found myself pulling into the driveway. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe. The need to feel like I wasn't alone out here. The gravel crunched under my tires as I rolled down the long, winding drive. The house at the end was a wreck, barely holding together, with its windows broken and the paint peeling off in chunks. A rusty truck was parked in the overgrown yard, and a couple of sheds sat leaning at odd angles in the back, as if they were moments away from collapsing. I cut the engine and sat there for a moment, taking in the scene. The front door was open a crack, and I could see movement inside. That should have been my first clue to turn around, but I was in too deep now. I stepped out of the car, my feet sinking slightly into the mud, and approached the porch. The smell hit me before I even reached the steps. Something rotting. I figured it was just an animal that had died nearby. But as I got closer, the stench grew stronger, turning my stomach. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. Nothing. Just the wind rustling the leaves and that faint, distant laughter again. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and before I knew it, I'd pushed the door open. The inside of the house was dark, but I could make out the outlines of furniture scattered haphazardly around the room. The place looked abandoned, except for the faint glow of a lantern flickering in the back. I took a step inside, and that's when I saw him, an old man hunched over in a chair, his back to me. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his hair hung in greasy clumps. He didn't move, didn't seem to notice I was there at all. "Hey, you all right?" I asked, my voice quieter now, more cautious. Still nothing. I took another step forward, my foot catching on something soft. I glanced down and froze. A hand, no, not just a hand, an entire arm, was sticking out from underneath a tattered rug, fingers curled as if they were still trying to grasp onto life. Blood had pooled around the arm, dark and thick, staining the floorboards. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, but before I could turn to run, the old man spoke. "They don't like visitors much." His voice was raspy, dry, like he hadn't spoken in days. Slowly he turned his head to look at me and my stomach dropped. His eyes were hollow, sunken deep into his skull, and his lips pulled back in a grotesque grin, revealing teeth that were chipped and yellowed. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I bolted for the door, but as soon as I hit the porch, I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the back of the house. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them. 3 figures emerging from the shadows, their faces twisted and deformed. They looked like something straight out of a nightmare, their bodies hunched and misshapen, as if they were barely human. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking. But before I could get the door open, one of them was on me. He, or it, grabbed me by the shoulder and yanked me back with a strength that didn't match his frail appearance. I hit the ground hard, my vision blurring as pain shot through my side. "Don't leave yet," one of them croaked, his voice high-pitched and wheezing. I scrambled to my feet, but there were more of them now, closing in from all sides. I could see their faces more clearly in the dim light. Faces that were barely human, with skin stretched too tight over their bones and eyes that glinted with something primal. I fought back, swinging wildly, but they were on me in seconds. Hands clawed at my clothes, pulling me to the ground, and I could feel the sharp sting of nails digging into my flesh. I kicked and screamed, but it was like fighting against a pack of wild animals. Their laughter echoed in my ears, that same harsh, guttural sound I'd heard earlier, only now it was right next to me, surrounding me. They dragged me back toward the house, their grip unrelenting. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to escape, but I could feel my strength slipping away with each passing second. "Join us," one of them whispered, his breath hot against my ear. I was about to give up, to let them take me, when I heard the distant rumble of an engine. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. The cannibals paused, their heads snapping toward the road. Taking advantage of their distraction, I shoved one of them off me and stumbled toward the driveway. My legs felt like jelly and my vision swam, but I wasn't about to let them drag me back into that hellhole. I reached my car and slammed the door shut, just as the headlights of a truck appeared at the end of the driveway. The cannibals hesitated, their grotesque faces twisted with confusion, and I seized the opportunity. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. The car roared to life, and I floored it, gravel spraying as I tore out of the driveway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove for miles, my heart hammering in my chest until I finally hit the main road. When I reached the nearest town, I pulled into the gas station, my hands still trembling. The clerk eyed me warily as I stumbled inside, covered in dirt and blood. But I didn't care. I needed to get away from that place. I needed to forget what I saw. The next morning, I woke up in a dingy motel room, the events of the night before playing over and over in my mind like a broken record. I thought about going to the police, telling them what happened. But what could I say? That I was nearly killed by a family of inbred cannibals in the backwoods of West Virginia? No one would believe me. Hell, I barely believed it myself. I packed up my things and hit the road again, this time sticking to the highways. I didn't take any more wrong turns, didn't stop at any more lonely houses. I kept my head down and drove, trying to outrun the memories. As for the family, they're still out there, I'm sure. When you work in my line of business, you learn to expect the unexpected. My name is Cedric Wainwright, and I've spent the last decade of my life hunting things that most people only talk about in hushed whispers around campfires. When I tell people I work for a specialized unit under the Department of Defense, they assume I'm dealing with terrorists or maybe a rogue state here and there. If only it were that simple. It's been a long, winding road to get here. I wasn't always hunting cryptids. I started as a biologist, believe it or not, working in the wetlands of Florida, tagging alligators and studying migratory bird patterns. I had a quiet, uneventful life until a few of my colleagues went missing under mysterious circumstances. The government swooped in, and before I knew it, I was recruited. They needed someone with my skills who could keep their mouth shut. Apparently, I fit the bill. The town of Point Hope, Alaska was where my latest assignment took me. It's a desolate place tucked away on the edge of the world. The kind of place where the sun forgets to shine for months at a time. A handful of Inuit families call it home, along with a few adventurous souls who've decided to test their mettle against the wilderness. Point Hope isn't a place where you expect much action, which is precisely why it was the perfect breeding ground for something sinister. A couple of locals had gone missing and the town sheriff was at his wit's end. Normally, this would have been chalked up to the dangers of living so far north, wildlife attacks, falling through thin ice, or simply freezing to death. But this was different. The bodies had been found, or rather what was left of them. They were torn apart in ways that no bear or wolf could manage. The wounds were precise, almost surgical. The kind of carnage that even seasoned hunters would find difficult to stomach. I was flown in under the cover of darkness with a small team that included Dr. Isabel Montague, a forensic pathologist, and Lucas Reed, a tracker who had spent years in the Canadian Rockies. Reed was an odd character, quiet, almost reclusive, but there wasn't a person better suited to find whatever was out there. Our first night in Point Hope was uneventful. We set up in an old abandoned military outpost just outside town. It was cold, even for Alaska, with a wind that howled through the cracks in the walls like a banshee. We spent hours poring over the remains that had been recovered, trying to piece together what could have done this. "It's not human," Isabel said, more to herself than to anyone else. She was examining a chunk of bone with deep grooves etched into it. "These cuts, they're too deep, too clean. It's like whatever did this knew exactly how to maximize damage." Reed was studying a map of the area, his finger tracing the paths between the attack sites. "The pattern doesn't make sense," he muttered. "No natural predator moves like this. It's like it's playing with its food." We all knew that something about this wasn't right, but none of us were prepared for what we found the following night. The plan was simple: follow the tracks Reed had identified and see where they led. The snow was thick, and the wind cut through our clothing like knives, but we were determined. We were armed to the teeth, not just with the usual firearms, but with experimental weapons designed for things that shouldn't exist. The tracks led us deeper into the wilderness, far from the relative safety of the town. The further we went, the more I could feel it, that oppressive weight that settles on your shoulders when you know you're being watched. Reed was tense too, his eyes scanning the tree line with a paranoia that made my skin crawl. We found the cave just before midnight. It was a gaping maw in the side of a cliff, hidden from view by a thick curtain of ice and snow. The tracks led straight inside. "I don't like this," Reed whispered. His voice was barely audible over the wind. "This feels wrong." I didn't like it either, but we had a job to do. We advanced slowly, weapons drawn, ready for whatever was waiting for us in the darkness. The stench hit us first, a foul metallic odor that made my stomach churn. The cave was deep, twisting and turning like some ancient labyrinth. Our lights barely cut through the inky blackness, revealing only the walls slick with ice. Then we heard it, a noise that froze us in place. It was a sound I'd never heard before, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the earth. Reed shot me a glance, his face pale. We rounded a corner, and that's when we saw it. The creature was hunched over something, its massive form blocking out the light. It was difficult to make out details, but it looked like a grotesque hybrid of a bear and some kind of reptile. Thick, matted fur covered its body, but I could see scales glinting underneath. Its jaws were elongated, filled with the jagged teeth that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. It was feeding on something, one of the missing villagers, judging by the shredded remains. The creature's claws were longer than my forearm, each one sharp enough to tear through flesh and bone like paper. It moved with a sickening grace, every motion fluid and calculated. We didn't hesitate. Reed fired first, his shot echoing through the cave like a thunderclap. The creature reacted instantly, its head snapping up to look at us with a cold, calculating intelligence. It roared, a sound that I can only describe as a mixture between a lion's bellow and the grinding of metal, and charged. The next few moments were a blur of gunfire and chaos. The creature moved faster than anything that size had any right to. It was on us in seconds, tearing through our defenses like they were nothing. Reed went down first, his screams cut short as the beast's claws found their mark. Isabel and I kept firing, but it was like trying to bring down a tank with a BB gun. The bullets barely slowed it down. It lunged at me, and I felt its claws rake across my side. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but I didn't stop. I emptied my entire magazine into its chest, and finally it staggered, giving Isabel the opening she needed to plant an explosive round directly into its mouth. The detonation shook the cave, and for a moment, everything went silent. The creature collapsed, its body twitching as it let out one last rasping breath. Isabel slumped to the ground beside me, her face a mask of shock and exhaustion. "We need to get out of here," she gasped. I nodded, my own breath coming in ragged gulps. We dragged ourselves out of the cave, the creature's corpse left behind as a twisted monument to the nightmare we had just survived. When we finally made it back to the outpost, I collapsed on one of the cots, my mind still reeling from the encounter. The cleanup crew arrived the next day, and the creature's body was taken away for analysis. They don't tell us what happens after, and frankly, I don't care. My job is done when the monster is dead. Point Hope returned to its quiet, frozen existence. The villagers knew something had happened, but they didn't ask questions. They never do. People like us, those who hunt the things that go bump in the night, we exist to keep the world from falling apart. But it's not something you brag about or put on a resume. As I boarded the plane back to headquarters, I couldn't help but think about Reed. He was a good man, and his death was senseless, just like so many others in this line of work. But I didn't dwell on it. You can't afford to. The flight attendant offered me a drink, and I accepted, letting the warmth of the whiskey spread through me. The wind was howling outside the plane, but inside it was quiet, peaceful even. I took another sip, leaned back in my seat, and closed my eyes. My name is Raylan Boudreau, and back in 2011, I was working out of Kaniksu National Forest in Idaho, a sprawling place of evergreens and valleys with rumors older than the trees themselves. I'd been with the U.S. Forest Service for about 6 years then, having traded a normal desk job in the city for the woods, but never quite anticipated the type of things I'd encounter out here. My colleagues liked to joke about what goes bump in the night, but it was usually just a way to laugh off the strange things you'd see on the night shifts. I'm not sure why anyone really wanted to be on duty that particular evening. The day had been dreary, with thick fog rolling off the lake, blanketing everything in a heavy mist that made the pines look like looming shadows. If I hadn't been rostered for an overdue hiker check, I would have been back in my bunk, pretending the world was still insane. But the protocol's protocol, and if someone's missing for over 24 hours, we're expected to comb the forest. Someone probably tripped over a log and sprained an ankle, I muttered to myself as I strapped on my pack, reaching for my radio. It was an old model with a faint static hum, like the ones in bad horror movies where you just know it'll give out at the worst possible moment. The missing person in question was a guy named Carter, an outdoorsy type who'd done solo hikes around here a few times before. According to his friend who'd waited back at the lodge, he was supposed to be back a day and a half ago, but hadn't returned, which was unusual for him. So, Carter's friend got spooked enough to call it in. The air was thick with a smell that reminded me of damp moss and something metallic that set my nerves on edge. As I made my way deeper into the fog, the quiet around me seemed to intensify, as though even the birds were reluctant to break the stillness. The last spot anyone had seen Carter was near this ravine up in the western stretch, notorious for steep drop-offs and narrow trails that could send an unsuspecting hiker sliding 50 feet down with one misstep. I clicked on my flashlight as the trail darkened beneath the canopy of trees. A shiver crept along my back, though I chalked it up to the chill that came with the mist settling in like a cold, wet blanket. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew I'd been brushing off my instincts, ones that were screaming for me to turn back. It was about an hour into my hike when I noticed something strange. Claw marks. They were gouged deep into the bark of a tree, like something had raked against it with unnatural force. Blackish sap oozed from the gouges, thick as tar, and for some reason it reminded me of blood clots. I reached out to touch it, half regretting the decision as soon as I felt the sticky residue cling to my fingers. Whatever left these marks wasn't just another bear or cougar. My stomach twisted as I saw more of those claw marks, each marking a tree closer to the ravine. It was as if something had trailed Carter, inching closer, shadowing his every step. The thought of something actively tracking him, an apex predator playing with its prey, made me grip my flashlight tighter. As I moved forward, the landscape seemed to shift, and the familiar path began to twist and turn in ways that didn't quite add up. Then I smelled it. Foul, rotting. A stench that had no place in the fresh, damp forest air. My first thought was a decaying carcass. Maybe a deer that had gone belly up somewhere nearby. But this scent carried a bite. Something rancid and wrong. Ahead of me was the start of a cave mouth I hadn't noticed before. It was partly obscured by dense undergrowth and twisted vines that hung like silent sentinels, warning of the shadows beyond. I don't know what possessed me to step closer, but curiosity has always been my Achilles heel. I called out, half expecting silence, but I heard something. A sound that was wet, dragging like flesh scraping over stone. It didn't sound human, nor did it sound fully animal, but it was alive and moving. I took a cautious step forward, swinging my flashlight into the cave, and that's when I saw it. A shredded hiking boot, torn at the seams with something smeared across the leather. The laces were stiff and tangled, as though yanked at violently. I squatted down, pressing a finger to the wet smear, and felt the cold, sticky texture of dried blood. The scraping sound continued, and as I shifted my light upward, I caught a glimpse of something half hidden in the shadows. It moved just outside the reach of my flashlight, and for a moment I swore I saw limbs, elongated and thin, like twisted branches wrapped in something sinewy and dark. The figure held still, watching me, and I had the sudden impression it was grinning, though I couldn't make out a face. Instinct screamed at me to run, but as I took a step back, the creature lunged. It came into the beam of my flashlight for a fraction of a second, just enough for me to register its distorted shape, a cross between a wolf and something insect-like, with matted fur and grotesque limbs that bent the wrong way. Its claws glistened, slick with something thick and dark. I fell back, scrambling, adrenaline kicking in as I yelled into my radio, hoping the static would miraculously clear up. I heard a faint crackle, but no response. The thing loomed over me, moving closer, dragging its limbs with an unnatural slowness, almost as if savoring the fear rolling off me. With one desperate kick, I sent a loose rock flying toward its face, and by sheer luck it stumbled back just enough for me to get to my feet. I bolted, every rational thought drowned by the primal urge to survive. The ground seemed to blur beneath me, and my only goal was to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. But the creature wasn't giving up easily. I heard it lumbering behind me, that dragging sound relentless, like it was inches away. When I saw the break in the trees, I pushed myself harder, nearly tripping over my own boots. I stumbled out into a clearing, gasping for air, only to be greeted by a sight that made my blood run cold. A body slumped against a tree, or what was left of one. The remains were shredded beyond recognition, the clothing barely clinging to the battered frame. Whoever it was had met a violent end. In the briefest moment of clarity, I checked for any sign of movement, but the figure remained lifeless, one arm twisted at a grotesque angle, fingers curled in a silent scream. My radio finally crackled to life, a garbled voice shouting through the static, breaking through the suffocating silence. "We lost you out there, Boudreaux. Are you safe?" I didn't answer right away, too fixated on the remains before me, on the way the flesh had been stripped back as if by something ravenous, something that had taken its time. I muttered into the radio, my voice hollow. There's someone else here. Or there was. Silence answered me, and in the pit of my stomach, I knew I couldn't leave this place without answers. Whoever or whatever had done this couldn't be allowed to roam these woods. I made a decision then that went against every protocol. I headed back toward the cave, steeling myself against the primal fear that gripped me. The trail felt longer on the way back, and as I neared the cave entrance, the stench returned with a vengeance. I crept closer, my flashlight cutting through the gloom, and saw it huddled there, crouched over something that squelched as it fed. The creature lifted its head, jaws smeared with blood and bits of tissue, and turned those lifeless eyes on me. For a split second, we locked gazes, and I felt a chill that went beyond fear. I swung my flashlight like a weapon, slamming it into the creature's skull with every ounce of strength I had. It shrieked, stumbling back, its limbs flailing as it dropped to the ground, stunned. I took my chance, pulling out a pocket knife and plunging it into the creature's neck. The blade bit deep and it howled, thrashing against me, but I held on, driving the knife down with all the anger and terror I'd felt since I'd stepped into those cursed woods. Eventually, it went still, its body collapsing like a rag doll, and the twisted limbs stopped moving. The creature lay there, unmoving, its mouth twisted into something that almost looked like a grimace, as if in death it knew it had lost its prey. I staggered back, breathing heavily, wiping the blood from my hands, wondering what kind of nightmare I'd just survived. I radioed in the location, keeping my voice steady, though my hands still shook. They'd send a recovery team in the morning, I was told, but I had to get out. I walked back through the trees, exhaustion pulling at me, but an odd sense of satisfaction grounded me. Back at the lodge, they asked if I'd found anything unusual out there. I kept it simple, mentioning the wrecked body I'd come across, leaving out the gory details for the report. They didn't ask further questions, just gave me a look that said they knew better than to press. I grabbed my gear, packed it up, and left without looking back, my last thoughts drifting to the thing in the cave and the mess it had left behind. In my mind, I could still see it lying there, silent, defeated, and in the faintest flicker of dark humor, I thought maybe that thing wouldn't be needing another meal anytime soon. My name is Daryl Manning, and this happened to me on September 3rd, 1992. I remember the date because it was my wife's birthday, and I was hauling a load of steel from Pittsburgh to Kansas City. I'm a truck driver, have been for over 20 years, and nothing much rattles me. I've seen a lot out on the roads, but this night, this was different. I was somewhere in southern Ohio, on one of those stretches of highway where the radio signal fades and the road just stretches out endlessly. It was about 11 p.m., the sky was overcast and the air felt heavy, like it was about to rain. I pulled into a truck stop I'd never been to before. It was called Jake's Place or something like that. The neon sign flickered and buzzed, and the parking lot was half empty, which was unusual for that time of night. After fueling up, I went inside to grab a coffee. The place was pretty run down, with a few long-haul drivers scattered around, eating greasy burgers and sipping bad coffee. I sat at the counter, and the waitress, a woman named Carla with tired eyes and a smoker's cough, poured me a cup without saying much. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yeah, you could say that," I replied, taking a sip. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it did the job. I noticed a guy at the far end of the counter. He was tall, with a thick beard and a worn-out baseball cap. He kept glancing over at me, which made me a bit uneasy. You get a sense for these things on the road, and this guy gave off a bad vibe. I finished my coffee and decided to hit the road again, eager to put some miles between me and Jake's Place. Back in my truck, I checked my map and planned my route. I was aiming to reach a rest stop about 2 hours away where I could catch a few hours of sleep. As I pulled out of the lot, I noticed the bearded guy's truck following me. I brushed it off at first. Lots of guys head out around the same time. But after about 30 minutes of driving, he was still behind me, matching my speed. I started to get that itch between my shoulder blades, the kind you get when you know something's not right. I slowed down, hoping he'd pass me, but he didn't. He stayed right on my tail, and that's when I decided to take an exit at the last minute, the kind where you have to yank the wheel hard to make it. I wanted to see if he'd follow. Sure enough, he did. Now I was really spooked. This wasn't just coincidence. I drove down a dark, empty road, and the guy kept following me. I glanced at my fuel gauge, knowing I had enough to outrun him if I needed to, but the idea of a high-speed chase didn't sit well with me. Instead, I took another sharp turn onto an even smaller road, one that led into the woods. The road was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for two trucks to pass each other. The trees loomed over me, casting long shadows that flickered in my headlights. I kept looking in my mirrors, and he was still there. I was trying to come up with a plan, thinking maybe I could lose him in the trees or find a place to hide my truck. I saw a sign for a rest area up ahead, one of those small, almost forgotten places with a few picnic tables and a grimy restroom. I pulled in, hoping to find someone, anyone, but it was deserted. I parked my truck, left the engine running, and grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment. I didn't have a gun on me. I'd never felt the need for one on the road before, but now I was wishing I did. The other truck pulled in behind me, and I saw the bearded guy get out. He had a crowbar in his hand, which confirmed my worst fears. I ducked out the passenger side of my truck and hid behind some bushes, my heart pounding in my chest. I heard his footsteps crunching on the gravel as he approached my truck. "Hey, where'd you go?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the quiet night. I stayed silent, trying to control my breathing. He walked around my truck, hitting the sides with the crowbar. The sound was jarring, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he found me. I needed to make a move. I crept around the bushes, trying to stay in the shadows. My flashlight was off. I didn't want to give away my position. I was almost at the restroom building when I heard a scuffle behind me. I turned and saw another figure, a younger guy stepping out of a nearby truck. "What's going on here?" the young guy called out. He looked like he could handle himself, and I hoped he was on my side. The bearded guy turned to face him, raising the crowbar. "None of your business. Get lost." The young guy didn't back down. "Looks like you're the one who needs to get lost." I took the opportunity to move closer, hoping to surprise the bearded guy. But before I could do anything, he lunged at the young guy with the crowbar. They struggled, the sounds of their fight filling the night. I couldn't just stand there, so I rushed in, grabbing the crowbar from behind and yanking it out of the bearded guy's grip. He turned on me, his fists flying. We tumbled to the ground, wrestling for control. He was strong, but I had the advantage of surprise and adrenaline. I managed to get a hold of the crowbar again and swung it at him, hitting his leg. He yelled in pain, giving me a chance to get to my feet. The young guy recovered quickly and joined me. Together, we managed to subdue the bearded guy, tying him up with some bungee cords from my truck. We stood there, panting and bruised, looking down at him. "Thanks for the help," I said to the young guy, whose name I later found out was Kyle. "No problem. I saw him following you and knew something was up." We called the cops, and they arrived within 20 minutes. They took the bearded guy into custody, and after some questioning, we found out he was wanted for several assaults and robberies along the interstate. They told us we were lucky to be alive, which was something I already knew. After giving my statement, I got back on the road, more shaken than I'd like to admit. I made it to Kansas City without any more incidents, but I couldn't shake the feeling of that night. Every time I saw a truck following me, my heart would race, and I'd find myself checking my mirrors constantly. I took some time off after that, spent a few weeks with my wife and kids, trying to get back to normal. But the road called me back, as it always does. I've been driving ever since, but I'm a lot more cautious now. I keep a baseball bat in my cab and make sure to stay in well-lit, busy truck stops. And every time I pull into a place like Jake's place, I remember that night and the stranger who followed me into the dark. I guess the lesson here is that you never know who's out there, and sometimes it's not the road you have to worry about, but the people on it. So if you're ever out there late at night, keep your eyes open and your wits about you. You never know what might be waiting around the next bend. Kyle and I stayed in touch for a while, trading stories and checking in on each other. We even met up a few times when our routes crossed. It's funny how a near-death experience can bond you with someone you barely know. But life goes on, and we eventually lost touch. Last I heard, he'd left trucking to start his own business. I hope he's doing well. As for me, I'm still out here, 1 mile at a time, one haul at a time. It's a hard life, but it's the one I know. And every time I see a bearded guy in a baseball cap, I feel that familiar chill and grip the bat a little tighter. It's not fear exactly, but a reminder of how close I came to losing everything. So that's my story. It's not glamorous, and it's not something I like to dwell on, but it's a part of who I am, a part of the road that shaped me. And maybe, just maybe, it'll make you think twice the next time you're out there, driving through the night. My name is Samuel Reed, and back in 2017, I decided to take my newly acquired RV on a journey through the winding roads of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. After years behind a desk crunching numbers, I thought some fresh air and open spaces might do me good. Besides, how hard could camping be? It's like living at home but with more trees and fewer takeout options. I stocked the RV, affectionately named Old Bessie, with all the essentials: canned beans, a questionable amount of beef jerky, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. My friends joked that I'd be back within a day, begging for Wi-Fi and a hot shower. I was determined to prove them wrong, or at least not get eaten by a bear. Spoiler alert, bears were the least of my worries. The first day was uneventful, which in my book was a win. I found a secluded spot by a clear stream, set up camp, and even managed to start a fire without singeing my eyebrows off. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat outside sipping instant coffee, feeling like a rugged outdoorsman despite wearing socks with sandals. The next morning, I decided to explore a nearby trail. Armed with a map I could barely read and a compass I pretended to understand, I set off. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, birds chirping, leaves rustling, and my heavy breathing as I realized I was more out of shape than I thought. I stumbled upon a small waterfall and couldn't help but make a self-deprecating joke about finally finding the shower I needed. As I headed back, I noticed a rough-looking man chopping wood near a dilapidated cabin I'd somehow missed earlier. He was tall and lean, with a wild beard that suggested razors hadn't been invented yet. "Howdy," I called out, trying to sound casual. He looked up, his eyes sharp. "Didn't expect to see anyone around these parts." "Yeah, just doing some camping," I replied. "Name's Sam." He paused before responding. "Walter." "Nice to meet you, Walter. Didn't know anyone lived out here." He gave a curt nod. "Been here a long time." An awkward silence followed. "Well, I'll let you get back to it," I said, backing away slowly. "Be careful out here," he said cryptically. "Strangers can get lost." "Thanks for the tip," I muttered, turning on my heel. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were still on me. That evening I tried to brush off the encounter. Maybe he was just a hermit who wasn't used to company. I settled into the RV, locked the doors, because that's what you do in the middle of nowhere, and tried to read a book. Sleep came uneasily, with strange noises outside making me jump at every creak. Around midnight I heard footsteps circling the RV. My heart pounded. I grabbed the closest thing resembling a weapon, a cast-iron skillet, and held my breath. The footsteps stopped, and a faint scratching sound began near the door. Summoning what little courage I had, I flung the door open, skillet raised. No one was there. Feeling foolish, I stepped outside. The night was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I decided it was just a raccoon, or maybe a particularly bold squirrel. As I turned to go back in, something caught my eye. A small carved wooden figurine placed on the step. It was shaped like a human skull. "Very funny," I said aloud, hoping it was some prank by other campers. The next morning I decided to find Walter. Maybe he knew if there were other people around. Plus, returning his creepy knick-knack seemed like a good excuse. I headed toward the cabin but found it deserted. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Windows were shattered, the door hung off its hinges, and nature was reclaiming the structure. A chill ran down my spine. Had I imagined him? No, we definitely spoke. As I examined the cabin, I noticed something disturbing. Photographs pinned to a wall inside, all of different people who looked like hikers or campers. Some were crossed out in red ink. I snapped a photo with my phone, hand shaking. Time to leave, I thought. As I backed away, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around to see Walter emerging from the trees, a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, a sinister smile spreading across his face. "I was just poking around where you shouldn't be," he interrupted. I glanced at the rifle. "Look, I didn't mean any harm." He raised the gun slightly. "City folks never do." Without another word, I bolted. Adrenaline surged as I sprinted toward my RV. Branches whipped my face, and rocks threatened to trip me with every step. I could hear him behind me, his boots pounding the earth. "Can't run forever," he shouted. Challenge accepted, I thought grimly. I reached old Bessie and fumbled with the keys. My hands were slick with sweat. Finally, the door unlocked and I dove inside. I jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. "Not now, Bessie, come on." I glanced out the window to see Walter emerging from the woods, raising his rifle. I ducked as a shot rang out, the bullet shattering the side mirror. "Third time's the charm," I muttered, turning the key again. The engine roared to life. I slammed the RV into gear and stomped on the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, tires spitting gravel. As I sped down the dirt road, another shot hit the rear window, spiderwebbing the glass. I gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white. The narrow road twisted and turned, and the RV groaned in protest. I didn't care if I blew a tire or wrecked the suspension. I needed to get as far away as possible. After what felt like hours, I spotted a ranger station ahead. Relief washed over me. I pulled in recklessly, nearly hitting a parked jeep. I stumbled out, shouting incoherently. A park ranger rushed out to meet me. "Sir, are you okay?" "There's a man. He's trying to kill me," I gasped. The ranger guided me inside. "Calm down and tell me what happened." As I recounted the events, 2 more rangers joined us. They exchanged grim looks. "You're not the first to report something like this," one said. "Who is he?" I demanded. "Name's Walter Griggs," the first ranger replied. "Used to be a hunter until he lost his family in a fire. Been living off the grid ever since. Folks say he's now right in the head." "That's putting it mildly," I retorted. "We'll send a team out to find him," the ranger assured me. "In the meantime, you should stay here." I nodded, exhaustion hitting me like a freight train. They offered me a cot in the back room. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but make a dark joke to myself. Next time I want solitude, I'll just lock myself in the office supply closet. The rangers weren't able to locate Walter that night. The following morning, they escorted me back to my RV. The damage was worse than I thought. Tires slashed, windows broken, and the words, "No escape," carved into the driver's side door. "Looks like I'm not driving out of here," I said wryly. "We can arrange for a tow," the ranger offered. "Appreciate it." While we waited, I asked if they had any more information on Walter. "Legend has it he blames outsiders for what happened to his family," the ranger explained. "Thinks the government or tourists had something to do with it. He's been a ghost in these woods for years." "Great. I had to run into the one-man welcoming committee." The tow truck arrived, and soon old Bessie and I were on our way back to civilization. As we pulled onto the main road, I took one last look at the dense forest. Part of me half expected to see Walter standing at the tree line, rifle in hand. But there was nothing, just the sway of the trees in the wind. Back in town, I filed a report with the local authorities. They assured me they'd keep an eye out, but admitted that finding him in that vast wilderness was like finding a needle in a haystack. "Fantastic," I sighed. "At least needles don't usually shoot at you." With my RV in the shop and my nerves shot, I checked into a motel. The receptionist gave me a curious look as I walked in, probably due to the disheveled appearance and the lingering smell of fear. "Rough day?" she asked. "You could say that," I replied. "Got any rooms where the only thing I have to worry about is bad room service?" She smiled sympathetically. "I'll see what I can do." That night, I ordered an overpriced burger and flipped through channels aimlessly. A news report caught my attention. Local authorities are investigating reports of a man threatening campers in the Great Smoky Mountains. "No kidding," I muttered. The next morning, I got a call from the ranger station. They'd found more evidence at Walter's cabin. Personal belongings from missing hikers and a makeshift journal detailing his plans to cleanse the woods of intruders. He's a real piece of work, I said. We advise you to stay away from the area until we apprehend him, the ranger cautioned. Don't have to tell me twice. With my RV still under repair, I decided it was time to head home. Maybe the concrete jungle wasn't so bad after all. At least the only predators there were aggressive taxi drivers and the occasional pigeon with a grudge. As I boarded the bus out of town, I couldn't resist making one last joke to the driver. Any chance this thing is bulletproof? He gave me a puzzled look. No. Figures, I said, taking a seat. The bus pulled away, and I watched as the mountains faded into the distance. I thought about Walter Griggs, a man consumed by his own madness, turning his pain into violence against strangers. His motivations were his own, twisted and dark. But that was behind me now. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and decided that my next vacation would be somewhere safer. Like a nice, quiet beach.